You are in your own backyard, a place you consider private and protected. But suddenly, police show up looking for someone else, and they decide to break down your gate. Is this legal? And if you have no trespassing signs up all over the place, does this do anything to stop the cops? In this video, we're breaking down what the law says about how you can protect your yard from unexpected visits from the cops. You'll learn when cops can legally enter your property without a warrant, and more importantly, what you can do to stop cops from entering your property with those no trespassing signs. Because without the right precautions and your knowledge of the law, you could be left unprotected, and that could cost you dearly with the police. So we all know that the United States Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, is designed to protect us from unreasonable searches and seizures. But can cops just decide to storm onto your property if they're looking for someone else? What if cops show up and they're not even really looking for anyone, but they decide to ignore your no trespassing signs? Does the sign even matter? For the police to enter your home, they need a warrant, or they need some specific exception to the Fourth Amendment to justify it. Your yard is similar, but there are some very specific key differences we need to discuss. The law refers to the private area immediately surrounding your home as the curtilage. This is areas like maybe your front porch or right on your back patio, areas that are immediately surrounding your home. The law says that you have a reasonable expectation of privacy here, even though it's not within the walls of your home. The good news is, if this area is considered curtilage, the Supreme Court has ruled that the curtilage has the same level of protection as the inside of your home. That means the police need a warrant to enter or some specific exception to the warrant requirement. So what if your Karen neighbor calls the cops on you claiming some type of noise complaint? And maybe you're in your backyard hanging out with your friends having a good time. Cops try to get your attention, but because you have some classic rock playing in the backyard, you don't initially hear them. You have clearly posted no trespassing signs on your gate, and you've made it clear on the public areas of your property, no trespassing. Despite this, the cops enter through your gate. They confront you, they demand your ID, and they start questioning you about the noise complaint. Can cops just enter your backyard without a warrant or without your permission? Only if the cops can satisfy one of the three ways they can legally trespass onto your property. The first way is visually. The police can technically look into your yard, your front yard, or your backyard, or even your curtilage from any place that any other person in the public might have access to, if they can see you. This could range from a cop just deciding to stand at your property line, or grabbing binoculars and looking from across the roadway to see what's going on. Or you could get more advanced and cops could start using things I've talked about before, like drone technology or pole cameras or any other types of technology that allow them to be able to see what's going on your property, as long as it's from a vantage point that any other member of the public could access. The police also have a license to enter onto your walkway or to your driveway just as much as any other member of the public would have. In the case of Robinson versus Commonwealth, the cops had received an anonymous call about so-called underage drinking going on at the residence. So they showed up, and what did they see? Of course, they saw kids there holding beer bottles. They then dropped the beer bottles and took off. The homeowner was convicted of giving alcohol to minors, but he appealed his conviction. The Court of Appeals affirmed his conviction, claiming that on the night in question, Mr. Robinson had impliedly consented to members of the public, including the cops, to enter his residence. How is this possible? Well, the court relied on the fact that Mr. Robinson had an open, accessible driveway. They had a front door that was wide open, and they had a porch that was accessible to anyone else who could have walked up. In fact, the court said that the police had an implied consent to approach that front door or walk into the house as much as an Amazon driver could have pulled up, parked, picked up their packages, and walked up and delivered it to the front door. The next example of how cops can trespass onto your property is what's known as emergency situations or exigent circumstances. Exigent circumstances exist whenever there's a situation that is so urgent, cops claim they don't have time to get a warrant. Classic examples of these would be if the cops claim they think someone's about to destroy evidence and they don't have time to get a warrant, or maybe there's a public safety concern where they don't think they have time to get a warrant before something dangerous happens. So what does this mean? It means that if police have probable cause that some crime is taking place, plus exigent circumstances, they can enter into your home or on your curtilage without a warrant. This catch-all provision is relied upon police all the time when they don't think they have enough information. When cops don't really know what's going on inside, I've seen them rely all the time upon claiming that somebody may have fled into the house or about to flee out of the backyard, or they claim that they think some type of evidence may be actively being destroyed. In fact, this is a big part of the reason why the appeals court allowed the cops to enter Mr. Robinson's backyard. He was allegedly concerned about the safety of the kids who had dropped the beers and run towards the woods. But the most classic example of this situation was the tragic news of what happened in Idaho with a terrible shooting just a few years ago. In a horrible situation that took place, the police actually shot and killed a man sitting in his own backyard. Joe Johnson was just sitting in his backyard relaxing, while the police nearby were searching for a man who had fled a routine traffic stop. The police then received a tip that the man who fled the scene was actually at a certain GPS coordinates, which just so happened to be in Joe's backyard. Officer Cerdos entered Joe Johnson's backyard, fired one single shot, killing Mr. Johnson, believing that he was the suspect. The tragedy? Joe had done nothing wrong. In fact, later they found the suspect hiding nearby in a neighbor's shed. Officer Cerdos was later indicted for involuntary manslaughter, but the tragedy is his case was actually dismissed. Given this exigent circumstances rule, the court ruled that Officer Cerdos was allowed to be in Joe Johnson's backyard. The court found that Officer Cerdos acted reasonably because he was in hot pursuit of someone he thought was a convicted felon, and he specifically thought that Joe Johnson was that man. Now, we just covered a terrible tragedy about a man being shot in his own backyard by the police. But how do we know when we are reading the news whether it's truly fair and unbiased? This is precisely why I use Ground News. In fact, you can check them out at ground.news/Hampton. In today's world of media bias and censorship, you never really know if you're getting the full story. By gathering news from over 50,000 news sources from around the world and then ranking those articles from left to right, Ground News gives you the freedom to be able to read the news and decide if what you are reading is fair and unbiased. And it allows you ultimately to draw your own conclusions about what's going on in the world. And isn't that what the news is supposed to be about? So here's how it works. Let's take the recent news story of Tyreek Hill as an example, and let's check it out on Ground News. If we look at this recent news story about Tyreek Hill calling for the officer who pulled him over to be fired, we can see that almost 100 sources are covering this story, with coverage mostly coming from the left and center. We can see that 79% of the articles are highly factual. We can also learn who owns these news sources to see if they are objective and how exactly the headline is being manipulated by the different news agencies. In fact, if we look over at the headlines, we can compare the news coverage for ourselves, and we can see how the story is being projected by different news agencies. For example, this headline on the left attempts to paint a full picture of what happened, while this headline on the right mentions Hill acknowledging he could have handled it better while still calling for the officer to be fired. Does that mean that one side's right or the other side is wrong? No. What matters is I want to know the full picture of the news so that I can make the decision and the conclusion myself. Now, one of my favorite features of Ground News is the blind spot feed. The blind spot feed shows you stories that are being underreported by one side of the political spectrum. This feature really helps you see what you're missing out on in the news if you only read from news sources from the left or strictly from the right. I personally found this feature to be an amazing way to discover stories that I was missing out on because only one side of the spectrum was talking about it. The best part of all of this is that Ground News has a special offer for all of our viewers. If you sign up through my link, ground.news/Hampton, you'll get 40% off the Vantage plan, the plan that gives you access to all the unlimited features. So what are you waiting for? Scan the QR code here on the screen or click the link down in the description below to sign up today. Personally, I think Ground News is doing important work, and I really encourage you to check them out. Go to ground.news/Hampton, just like you see on the screen, and give it a try. So how exactly are cops able to approach our home without a warrant? We've covered how courts have given police officers an implied license to walk right up to our front door and knock in order to talk. Now, every time I mention knock and talks on my YouTube channel, I'll get tons of comments talking about, hey, what about no trespassing signs? That should force cops to stay off of my property. That raises the question, do these no trespassing signs actually work to keep cops off your property? To explore this, let's examine a case from the 10th Circuit where a man did exactly that. This guy not only put a sign on his front door saying no trespassing, he put them literally all over his property. So even if you place dozens of no trespassing signs all over your property and on your front door, does that in any way stop cops from doing the classic knock and talk? The case we're talking about is United States versus Carlos. Mr. Carlos had multiple professionally printed no trespassing signs posted all around his house and his yard. The signs were yellow with black lettering prominently posted for everyone to see. He had one sign near the driveway. He had another no trespassing sign attached to a tree in the side yard. And finally, there was even a huge sign on the front door stating, posted, private property, hunting, fishing, trapping, or trespassing for any purpose is strictly forbidden. Violators will be prosecuted. Despite these signs all over the place, 2 ATF agents decided to approach the front door of Mr. Carlos's home. Now understand, they had received a tip from someone that Mr. Carlos was a convicted felon and that he might have a machine gun. A key fact to know here is that there was no fence or barrier to stop the ATF agents from being able to gain access to the front door. The ATF agents then knocked on the front door for several minutes. Some friend of Mr. Carlos's named Heather Wilson, she came out the back door and met the officers in the side yard area. After explaining why they were there, Mr. Carlos recognized the ATF agents out there speaking to Heather Wilson, so he came out to confront them as well. Well, of course, they started asking him, hey man, you got a machine gun inside your house? And Mr. Carlos clammed up and decided not to answer. The agents then asked Mr. Carlos the dreaded question, hey man, do you mind if we take a look around your house to see what we find? Mr. Carlos then said, hey, I don't own this house. I'm going to have to talk to the owner about it first. According to Mr. Carlos, when he said he was going to go back inside to talk to the owner, the agents refused to let him go alone, and they demanded that they be allowed to accompany him inside. The officers, on the other hand, they just claimed they asked Mr. Carlos if they could go inside with him, and they claimed that he said yes. Regardless, once the agents got inside Mr. Carlos's house, they found paraphernalia, they found possible drugs, and then they found a white powdery substance in his room. That led them to going to get a search warrant to search the entire house. After obtaining the warrant, the cops came back and of course they found multiple firearms and different types of illegal drugs, which led to Mr. Carlos being charged with drug possession and illegal weapons possession. Mr. Carlos claimed that all of this evidence should be thrown out, because even though they walked up to his door under a knock and talk exception, he had no trespassing signs all over his yard and all over the front of his house. In fact, Mr. Carlos specifically argued that these no trespassing signs revoked the implied license that the Supreme Court gave to the police. The court now had to determine whether no trespassing signs all over the property would be enough to keep cops off of your front yard and off of the knock and talk exception at your home. The court first had to decide about the implied consent to approach your front door by the police. We know that the Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and under that, the cops must have a warrant. But the court said that a knock and talk is actually not under the Fourth Amendment, and instead it's considered a consensual encounter. So the cops didn't even have to have reasonable suspicion to come up to your front door and knock. But what about those no trespassing signs? The court then ruled that no trespassing signs alone do not create what they called a special privacy zone, and they don't provide you any extra Fourth Amendment protection. Here's the crazy part. The court also ruled that even though these signs might work to keep private individuals off of your property, they don't provide some special protection to keep cops off your property for knock and talks. The court then got into the distinction between curtilage and open field when it comes to your property. We've already identified the Fourth Amendment protects the inside of your home completely and the curtilage, that area immediately surrounding the outside of your home. But for Mr. Carlos, the court said that the yard, because it did not have a fence or a specific enclosure, was more like an open field, which provided no real protection, as opposed to curtilage, which has the same level of protection as the inside of your home. Finally, the court in Mr. Carlos's case appeared to be confused about the text language that was on these signs. The court then really relied upon the wording on Mr. Carlos's trespassing signs, used wording like hunting, fishing, trapping, and they said that is not typical for activity that takes place on the curtilage of a home. The court then argued, very weakly by the way, that the lack of specific language on that no trespassing sign made it a bit ambiguous as to whether or not Mr. Carlos really wanted to keep people off of his property. So now that we know what police can do to legally enter your yard, what can you do to protect yourself and stop cops from trespassing on your property? Here are 3 steps you can take to enhance your privacy and keep cops off of your private property. Number 1, put up a privacy fence. Not just a regular see-through fence. Put up a privacy fence. It doesn't have to necessarily be a 10-foot fence, but I'll be frank with you, the taller and the higher, the better. Even if you only put up a 3 or 4 foot fence and you put up no trespassing signs and it's a privacy fence, you're making it clear not only to the general public, but you're making it clear to the police that you are limiting their access to your property. Number 2, post signs. Put no trespassing signs up everywhere that is visible to the general public. Not only should you fence your property, but you should use specific, clear language on your no trespassing signs. Remember, the court let Mr. Carlos be convicted because they claimed they were confused by his sign. If you post these signs in all visible areas where any member of the public may gain access, this now becomes your exhibit number 1 for the defense if a cop just randomly claims they found their way onto your property and they had no idea you didn't want them there. Number 3, lock all of your gates. When you lock your gates, you make it very clear, both with a privacy fence, no trespassing signs, posted publicly, as well as a locked gate, makes it clear that not only the general public is not allowed onto your property, but the police are also not welcome. By putting up a privacy fence, posting clear language signs all over your property in areas that people have public access, as well as locking your gates, you're making it clear, both to the general public as well as to the police, that they are not welcome on your property and that their implied license to approach has been denied. Let this be a lesson to all of us. A sign alone is just not going to get it done. In fact, a sign is just ink on a board unless you've got a fence to back it up. Now, what if cops ignore your no trespassing signs and they walk up to your front door and they knock anyway? What exactly can you do to protect yourself? Check out this next video where I break down 5 tips when the cops come knocking. See you over there.